Imagine trying to steer a massive cargo ship loaded with millions of tons of wheat through a body of water where invisible lines are drawn by naval mines, floating debris, and the constant threat of military interception. That is the fragile reality of international trade routes in the Black Sea right now, where every single nautical mile of transit is a high-stakes gamble for global food security. Welcome to the complex web of geopolitics, commerce, and survival that defines the modern battle over maritime corridors. The primary parties locked in this ongoing diplomatic and logistical chess match are Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, and a vast network of international shipping stakeholders, insurers, and commodity traders whose livelihoods depend on keeping these waters open. At the heart of this intense standoff is the expiration and bitter renegotiation of previous maritime agreements, most notably the landmark Black Sea Grain Initiative that once allowed millions of agricultural exports to safely bypass wartime blockades. What is at stake here is far larger than any single nation's balance sheet. We are talking about global grain supplies, the stability of food prices for millions of vulnerable households worldwide, and the immediate economic survival of regional economies that rely heavily on agricultural trade. To understand how we arrived at this precarious juncture, we have to look back at the chronological timeline that kicked off this modern maritime drama. The initial grain corridor agreement, brokered in the summer of 2022 under the joint auspices of the United Nations and Turkey, was hailed as a diplomatic breakthrough that temporarily lowered global food inflation and eased hunger fears across importing nations in Africa and the Middle East. For nearly a year, despite ongoing hostilities, ships successfully moved millions of metric tons of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil out of blockaded Ukrainian ports. But that delicate architecture proved vulnerable when the deal ultimately collapsed amid disputes over banking connections, fertilizer exports, and security guarantees. When that initial agreement lapsed, it left a massive void in the international grain market and forced all affected parties to scramble for new ways to keep cargo moving. Enter Turkey, whose strategic geographic position straddling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits places it at the very center of Black Sea commerce. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has since maintained a delicate and demanding diplomatic balancing act, positioning Ankara as an indispensable mediator that preserves trade ties with Moscow while honoring its NATO obligations and supporting Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. Turkey's primary interest in this dynamic is twofold: maintaining regional stability on its maritime doorstep and securing a central role in any future trade architecture that grants Ankara diplomatic leverage on the global stage. Meanwhile, Russia's stated interests have consistently centered around security checks, naval constraints, and the removal of perceived obstacles facing its own agricultural and fertilizer exports. Moscow has frequently argued that the original agreement failed to deliver adequate relief for Russian shipments due to secondary Western sanctions affecting banking, insurance, and logistics networks, while also expressing deep security concerns regarding the inspection of inbound vessels. On the other side of the negotiating table, Ukraine's stated interests in maintaining open export lanes are rooted in nothing less than economic and political survival. With its traditional deep-water ports constrained or heavily contested, agricultural exports represent a vital lifeline for Ukraine's national budget, keeping farms operational and foreign currency flowing into an economy battered by prolonged conflict. When the original UN-backed deal collapsed, this urgent necessity led directly to the emergence of alternative unilateral shipping corridors. Working closely with international partners, Kyiv established a temporary maritime corridor hugging the western coastline of the Black Sea, near Romania and Bulgaria, allowing cargo vessels to slip through regional waters outside of formal multilateral agreements. Yet these alternative paths are far from simple or risk-free, as recent maritime incidents, sudden spikes in war risk insurance premiums, and persistent regulatory bottlenecks have severely restricted traffic and squeezed profit margins for grain merchants. Insurers have grown increasingly wary of underwriting voyages through active operational zones, and regulatory delays at inspection checkpoints have turned routine shipments into sluggish, costly endeavors. As diplomats and negotiators continue to grapple with these bottlenecks, the shadow of past breakdowns looms large over every discussion about reviving or restructuring Black Sea trade. The history of fractured agreements and escalating maritime friction sets the stage for immediate diplomatic showdowns and a scramble to define the next era of Black Sea navigation. Right now, in the diplomatic corridors of Ankara, Moscow, and Kyiv, high-stakes talks are moving quietly but intensely behind closed doors. Turkey has positioned itself once again at the center of the diplomatic maze, acting as the primary mediator attempting to stitch together a new framework for Black Sea navigation. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his foreign policy team are actively engaged in shuttle diplomacy, trying to find a delicate middle ground that satisfies the security demands of the Russian Federation while keeping vital trade lanes open for Ukrainian agricultural exporters. These ongoing negotiations are not about reviving the exact text of the original 2022 Black Sea Grain Initiative, which famously fractured under mutual grievances and expired, but rather about drafting a brand new, modernized mechanism. Ankara is pushing for a revised set of navigational rules that could potentially decouple commercial food and fertilizer shipments from broader geopolitical flashpoints, aiming to insulate civilian merchant vessels from the direct theater of naval conflict. Turkey has increasingly championed alternative security frameworks designed to reassure both insurers and shipowners. Rather than relying on a centralized multilateral accord overseen by distant international bodies, these reported initiatives involve localized, pragmatic safety guarantees. Ankara has floated concepts that could potentially involve enhanced technical monitoring, automated transponder requirements, and regional maritime coordination centers designed to verify that commercial vessels are carrying strictly civilian cargo. The core idea is to create a predictable environment where cargo ships can move through international waters without triggering military alarm bells or inviting accidental escalation. However, constructing such a framework requires overcoming deep-seated mutual distrust. Moscow wants absolute clarity on cargo contents to prevent the corridor from being utilized for military purposes, while Kyiv and its international supporters are fiercely protective of their sovereign maritime rights and refuse to accept any restrictions that would grant a foreign power a de facto veto over their export economy. Looking at how a revised or alternative agreement might function structurally, several operational models are currently on the table. One potential pathway involves expanding and formalizing the existing unilateral corridor system under a broader diplomatic umbrella, granting it official international recognition without requiring a formal restoration of wartime multilateral inspection hubs. Another structural possibility is the establishment of a specialized transit protocol negotiated under third-party facilitation, perhaps with technical backing from international maritime agencies to oversee technical clearance procedures in neutral ports rather than contested zones. Each of these models attempts to balance two competing realities, the absolute necessity of predictable commercial logistics and the brutal constraints imposed by an active regional conflict. If a workable structure is eventually agreed upon, it could provide much-needed legal and operational certainty for shipowners who are currently operating in a legal gray area. Yet, even as these diplomatic blueprints are discussed, the risks of military miscalculation remain painfully high in the Black Sea basin. The region is effectively a high-tension operational zone where naval patrols, floating ordnance, and electronic warfare create constant hazards for civilian shipping. A single navigational error, a misidentified radar contact, or an accidental close encounter between military vessels and cargo carriers could instantly derail months of delicate diplomatic progress. Furthermore, the financial architecture supporting these voyages remains deeply fragile. War risk insurance premiums, which spiked dramatically after the collapse of the original deal, continue to impose a heavy financial burden on grain merchants. If regional friction flares up or new naval restrictions are suddenly announced, underwriters can instantly hike premiums or withdraw coverage altogether, pricing smaller exporters out of the market and freezing trade regardless of what diplomatic agreements exist on paper. The potential impact of these regional restrictions extends far beyond the immediate coastline, rippling directly into global commodity markets and vulnerable importing nations. When Black Sea export channels are squeezed, global food price volatility increases, hitting developing economies in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia that rely heavily on affordable grain imports from the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. Any new regulatory bottleneck, whether driven by diplomatic gridlock, bureaucratic inspection delays, or localized naval confrontations, directly translates into tighter global supplies and higher grocery bills millions of miles away from the theater of conflict. Importing nations and international food security agencies are therefore watching the diplomatic maneuvering in Ankara and Moscow with intense anxiety, well aware that the stability of global food prices hangs on the ability of diplomats to secure predictable trade rules. Of course, it is crucial to emphasize that all of these potential outcomes remain possibilities and scenarios rather than predicted certainties. International diplomacy is notoriously fluid, and agreements that look promising during closed-door talks can easily stall when confronted with hard political realities on the ground. When evaluating these developments, observers must maintain a clear distinction between the stated national interests of the involved governments and any unverified assumptions about hidden motives. Russia has explicitly stated its security concerns and its desire for unimpeded access for its own agricultural goods. Ukraine has clearly stated its economic imperative to keep its ports functioning, and Turkey has publicly declared its commitment to regional stability and commercial freedom of navigation. Relying on these official positions, rather than speculative narratives, provides the only reliable baseline for understanding what is actually happening. As this diplomatic chess match continues to unfold, there is one concrete, checkable watchpoint the audience should keep an eye on next regarding upcoming negotiations and maritime announcements. Watch specifically for official communiques emerging from bilateral meetings between Turkish and Russian delegations in Ankara or Moscow regarding specialized technical protocols for Black Sea shipping lane inspections. Specifically, pay attention to whether negotiators announce a formal agreement on neutral port verification mechanisms or third-party technical oversight for commercial cargo vessels, as this will serve as the clearest tangible indicator of whether a new navigational framework is genuinely taking shape or simply remaining stalled in endless preliminary talks. Until those technical protocols are formally signed and tested on the water, the Black Sea grain trade will remain a high-stakes balancing act between geopolitical rivalry and global economic necessity. We are left watching a delicate game of maritime poker where every card played affects the price of bread from Kiev to Cairo. Thanks for joining us for this explainer on the shifting currents of Black Sea geopolitics. Stay tuned, stay critical, and we will catch you in the next episode.